Edgar Cayce's JESHUA, ZERUBBABEL, EZRA and Nehemiah. Part 2 of 3. The following readings are of individuals belonging to the first group, returning home to Jerusalem, which was led by Zerubbabel. Included here are readings of those individuals who were very close to Zerubbabel. During that period when the peoples of the Promised Land returned to that land from the exile, and under the leadership of Ezekiel did the entity return to the holy city, and among those of the household of Zerubbabel. The entity gained through this experience, giving self much in service of those who labored in the restoring of the temple and in the aiding of those who gathered of the worldly goods to make same possible, both from the house and lands of Artaxerxes, and also of the lands about the holy city, being of the household of those that warred with Sanballat during this rebuilding. In the name Corianel, and there were many that called the entity blessed during that experience. In that land when there was the return from the wanderings, and the walls of the temple were rebuilt, and as Zerubbabel led the peoples from the and from the Chaldean country, the entity among those that made for the betterment of the understanding influences of the peoples as a chosen peoples, as a peoples with a definite mission, a definite purpose, called of the divine to establish the name in a given place, a given purpose, to a waiting world. In the experience, many hardships. In the name Zephaniah, and the daughter of Zerubbabel, the entity led many to a better understanding of God's, Jehovah's, relationship to his people, making much, then, of the hangings of the new temple, and especially brocades have a peculiar fascination to the entity from this experience. In that experience, when the rebuilding of the walls of the holy city, the entity among those who builded in the temple, and also in the wall, under Zerubbabel did the entity first enter, and also under Nehemiah did the entity labor. In the name of Gegen. In that period known as the return to the Holy Land. The entity among those under the rule, the guide, the activity of Ezekiel, with those of Zerubbabel, as came into the Holy Land, and the entity assisted in again the establishing of the music in the temple worship, for remembering that these were first rebuilded, and as the peoples came in with the mind to work, the entity aided, and a musician in the temple, being under the supervision of Zerubbabel's offspring. In the name Apollinarius. During that period when there was the return to the land of promise. The entity then of those in favor with Xerxes, Ahasuerus, the king, and of the Persian or Syrian peoples, yet in sympathy with those returning to their promised land, not wholly accepting all of their laws, or their version of man's relation to man or man's relation to the creative forces, yet in sympathy with same, and a contender, and an aider to those peoples, in favor with the king, in favor with the peoples returning. A friend, then, both to Xerxes and Zerubbabel. In the name Zenzor. In that land now known as the Promised Land. The entity was among those during the return of the peoples to the Promised Land, in that period when Zerubbabel's force led the peoples back to the holy city. The entity was then among those who came of the mixed peoples from the land, yet claiming its heritage, and living up to it, the entity gained through the early portion of that experience. In that period when there was the returning of the peoples to the holy city. The entity then was among those who were in the temple service under Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel's people, Zerubbabel's family. In this the entity then was the leader in those of the harp, the cymbal, and those that made music for the cheering of those peoples in that period. In the name Zuri. The entity found much contentment, much satisfaction, in seeing the re-establishing of the service of Jehovah in that particular experience. In that period, that land, when there were the returning to the holy city. The entity was then among those of the first peoples to return, during that period when Zerubbabel led the peoples back again. Little thought, little care, little attention was taken by those people in that land as to whether foes were without or within, but with an eye single to return to a service of a one source, and one force, was uppermost in the minds of those of the priests that led the peoples back, not the high priest, but those of the priest's household and in those of the ones that were the entrers into the outer courts in the new established forces. The entity gained through this experience, in the name Plenhi. The entity was during those periods when there were many of those that had wandered away, or far afield from the understandings, when the peoples were to be returned to the temple service. It was to be rebuilded again, that they might worship their God according to the dictates of their own conscience, that again the book of the law might be established, and that again the joys of a people high in esteem, when they have loved those precepts of a living God, might be had. The entity then was among those in the household of Zerubbabel, among the daughters even of this priest that came again to the ruins and builded in the hearts of those that which might make for the preparations of those things to be kept in the minds and hearts of those whose bodies might be the channel through which the Son of David, the house, might be again raised to the influences to bring the Son of Man in the earth. The entity was in the Holy Land, when the chosen peoples made for the first return to the rebuilding of the city and of the temple, when Xerxes had given the authority to those peoples, that they might return to their own land. And as Zerubbabel set out for the long journey again to the city in the hills there in Jerusalem, the entity was among those of that company, and with the entering in aided in the setting of the home life again to the ordinances of the homes as of old. The entity aided in keeping the records for those peoples, being of the priestly tribe, and among those that had been set in the offices of such, though these, to be sure, were rather the leaders of the heads of the household, and the entity aided such in giving to those people an understanding in the preserving of that innate in her peoples as to the necessity, in the material law as well as in the moral law, of preserving of self in cleanliness, as well as in godliness, the preserving not only of the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. And truly, indeed, it may be said of the entity then, as a shy, that the people under her aid builded with a will, for they minded the things that pertain to God. The entity was in the period when there was the return from captivity of the chosen people, in the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, when Nehemiah returned with the orders from the king that had risen in power in the Persian land, or those lands about the mountain areas. The entity then was an aid to the peoples as they returned, coming first with Zerubbabel and aiding with those under Nehemiah. These the entity saw under varied activities, the one disregarding the influence of forces from without, relying wholly upon the spiritual promises from within that they would be cared for. Yet with the Nehemiah influence the entity saw those activities wherein there was the trusting to the power of might, to the name of the king, to the effect that this must produce upon those lands and peoples through which the first of the bands under Nehemiah passed. Then in the name Jeelbached, the entity gained, for the entity held close to those things that became the precepts, with those activities under Zerubbabel. Also the entity saw the greater application of those activative forces that impelled the writer of same to say that the work progressed, because they all had a mind and a purpose to work, to serve a living God. These should be ever those influences that prompt the activities of the entity in all its relationships, drawing more and more upon the meeting of that great I Am presence, as it was given to the fathers of old, whom shall I saith sent me? I am that I am. When these influences are relied upon, in the experiences of him, who has set his house in order, then such an one may be indeed be guided aright. Do not rely upon the fleshpots of Egypt, nor the places of the high hills, but rather in humbleness of purpose serve the Lord, for he is good. The entity was in that period when there was the return of the children of promise from captivity to the rebuilding of the walls of the city, to the rebuilding of the temple itself. Then as Zuakido, the son of Zerubbabel, the entity labored at the rebuilding, and was set as one of the sons who kept and gathered the tax that was to assist in the re-establishing of the temple service. The entity then, being overzealous as to those activities, was rebuked not only by those under Nehemiah, but those in the second return, as Ezra. Hence those things recorded as of Nehemiah's and Ezra's writings have in the entity a feeling of insecurity, insincerity. For the rebuke was deep to the entity. For had not the entity felt that those who were able to pay should repay for those who were unable to pay? Hence the innate feelings were higher even than the priesthood, and the entity was banished, becoming among those that, as it were, followed from afar. Yet the entity aided mightily, with its bodily strength in building up the city, in building up the walls round about. No wonder, then, that these have a peculiar feeling for the entity, yet at times one of repulsion, and again the feeling that there are those things mightier than the walls which bespeak of the efforts of man in those directions to set up that which may be sustaining as a monument, that should be builded rather as the lowly Nazarite gave, not in this mountain, nor in this city, rather in the hearts of men, should the God of Israel be worshipped. For he has given, as through this entity then, there is not required silver nor gold nor only sacrifices, but there comes the call that ye be just and patient and long-suffering with thy fellow man. For these bespeak the words of Jehovah rather than those that require this or that rule. And it was because of such a rebellious force of the entity that they ceased to labor on the walls, until Nehemiah came. Yet with a mighty labor did the entity give of the strength in that experience. In the present these influences bear mightily upon the entity's activities and the entity's seeking. Hold fast to that thou didst gain before the altar in the temple, that God loveth mercy and justice rather than ritual or might, that being patient, being kind, being gentle is more precious in the sight of Jehovah than the offering of many sacrifices, or the giving of bounty, or the requiring of this or that of the law itself. For who is the law? He that loveth mercy and justice, or he that ruleth in the thunder or in the might. God is a God of love. These things gave forth the entity, these ring true in the experience today. One of the most outstanding of its appearances in the earth, both for the mental and the spiritual development, and for the manners in which same may make for its relationships in the present, the entity was in the earth during those periods when there were those returns from captivity of the chosen peoples, and the rebuilding of the walls, the first rebuilding under Zerubbabel. That particular sojourn is of particular importance in the present because of the fact that the entity finds self in the present rather in close relationships with those with whom the entity was then associated. The entity's close relationships then with those activities made for the replenishing and re-establishing of the altars of Jehovah, and the building up of those activities in the city of Jerusalem. Then the entity was in those relationships as the wife of a brother of Zerubbabel, and, to be sure, of the tribes of the priesthood. And the entity aided then in making for strengthening of purposes in the hearts of those who labored under such circumstances that brought fear and trembling, owing to the various causes round about, the activities of the sons of Sanballat, and the peoples without the gates and the peoples that were left in what later came to be known as the mixed races, those of the Samaritans. The entity was among those of that period when there was the returning of the children of promise from alien lands to the rebuilding of the walls about Jerusalem, and the temple that was first begun, under Zerubbabel. For the entity, while not of the priestly family, was rather among the sons of Judah, and in direct lineage of the king that had been carried away captive, Zedekiah. In the name then to Zeddah, the entity's activities were in keeping the accounts of its own peoples as related to the edicts that had been issued by the king of the Persian land. The entity made for a development in these in many respects, only losing when there became questionings under the leaderships, as brought by Nehemiah. The entity may gain much from those experiences by the study of those things presented not only by Nehemiah, but by Ezra. The entity was in those periods when there was the return of a chosen people to their land for the re-establishing in the land of promise of a ritual service. There the entity, with Zerubbabel's handmaids, became a helpful influence. And with the coming then of the priest, or princess, and the prince in Nehemiah, we find the entity lent that aid which made for the helping of those that resisted the peoples round about. Not by might, not by power, but by lending a helping hand to those that suffered bodily, aiding in bringing to those a better understanding of that edict which was given by the king for the re-establishing of those services of a peoples in their own land. Then the name was Belenda, and the entity gained through the experience. For being misjudged for the associations with those then as of the heathens round about, as termed by those strangers in their own homeland, the entity felt within self as being misunderstood, and condemned, when innately within self there was known how the protection was brought even to many of those that labored upon the wall, as well as in those that were established. Yet if the entity will read very closely the 6th and 8th chapters of Nehemiah, it will find much that hearkens for an awareness of its presence there. Hold to those things that make for this ability to be tolerant, even with those that despitefully use thee. for it engenders strife to hold animosities. The entity lived in the earth during those days, when there was the returning of the peoples from the land of bondage, from under those activities of the priest that made overtures to the king that they be allowed to return to the holy city for the rebuilding of the walls and rebuilding of the temple. Hence the entity, with the group under those activities of that priest, made the journey to the holy city. There the entity in its activity set about those preparations for the hangings of the Holy of Holies, for those wherein the ark was again to be re-established. Why has there been so little considered of how, with the return, there was so little thought expressed as to where was the ark of the covenant, that was to remain ever in the Holy of Holies? It had not been destroyed, and was not destroyed, nor removed, until the Prince of Peace came, wherein there was the declaration, that neither in this city nor in this mountain, but in the hearts of men, will there be the meeting in the Holy of Holies. Hence the entity was an attendant in the activities about the temple service itself, and in the preparations of the badger skins, in the preparation of the colorings of same, in the preparations of all of the fine linens, of the hangings about the ark. In these were the entity's activities during that sojourn. The name then was Belder. The entity was in the now known Persian land, when there were those returnings for those peoples of Judah to the city of Zion, when there were the gatherings of those under Zerubbabel for the journeys back for their activity. The entity then was among those peoples who aided in the first upbuilding of the temple activity. And many of those things that became as of hearsay, as of tradition, as of the gatherings of those things that made for the activities, as they were renewed, came through the hands of the entity then, in the name Edgar. In the experience the entity gained, and the entity lost when those things that were turned into that for self-indulgence were such that privileges were sold to individuals for conveniences and satisfying of forces within self, these eventually brought destructive forces in the experience. Hence we may find in the experience of the entity in the present those periods when duty and the religion, earthly gains and the law of the innate self, clash. But hold fast to that which is the law of one, that ye may know in truth, as has been given, that house, that temple, that soul that finds itself divided against itself becomes one of turmoil. And what gaineth a man, though he gain the whole world in fame or fortune, and hath lost his own rest, his own peace, his own soul? The entity was in that experience, when there were the returnings of those children of promise from the Persian land, when those edicts had been made by Xerxes, when they had been given the privilege of those that would join with Zerubbabel in the return to the Holy of Holy Cities, there to re-establish the worship of God according to the dictates of their own conscience, and to those influences that had led and guided those peoples in the experience. The entity was among those that were born in captivity, to be sure, yet joined hard with those peoples not only that aided in giving comfort and aid to those that went with Zerubbabel, but with Nehemiah in his return with political influence and force. For then the entity represented not only the law of his peoples, but the law as an edict of the king, then changed. These made for those experiences, when it may be said there was the greater development of the entity in a material, in a soul, in a mental experience. For the application of the law as interpreted and read by Ezra in the hearings of the entity, then Abijah, produced in the activities of the entity the making of the first overtures to those about the activities in the city when the temple had not only been rebuilt, but when the walls were being rebuilded, that made for peace and harmony. Hence the entity in its activities while as a law interpreter, as a lawgiver, as a law deviser in ways and means, will ever be in the capacity rather to make peace than to stir up strife among peoples or groups or nations or states. Thus the activity in that same capacity in the present may bring the greater development, bringing the greater harmony and peace into the experience of the entity in the present. The entity was in the land now known as the Persian and the Arabian, during those experiences and periods when there were those preparations for the return of those peoples held in bondage for that preparation of the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem and in the holy city. The entity then was among those peoples that aided in persuading king, who gave helpful advice and counsel to Zerubbabel, encouraging the hearts of Ezra and Nehemiah. For the entity then was that one, or as one who had not neglected counsel of those who had given, keep these laws upon thine heart, bind them upon thine forehead, teach them to thy children that they depart not from the Lord. Hence the entity was as the mother of those who would remember, bringing to those that were the leaders the encouragement necessary, not only for the trials of the passage, but encouraged them in building in their lives and hearts and associations, as one to another the remembrance of that which had been given. Separate yourself if ye would become as those that would know the Lord and his ways. And as those activities went forward, the entity gave the blessings to those, though not seeing the city for its rebuilding herself. Then in the name Esdras. The entity was in a portion of the Chaldean land, when the peoples were in bondage, and when ways, means and manners were sought that would bring about a change of purpose in the heart of the king that would allow for the freeing of the people, that they might return to their city for the re-establishing of worship according to the dictates of their conscience, for the rebuilding of the temple, for the rebuilding of the walls. The entity was of the Chaldeans, but to this entity did Zerubbabel, Nehemiah, Ezra seek for counsel that the heart of the king might be turned by those supplications of the entity, Zeus then, to the king Artaxerxes and the peoples in those periods of activity. Thus may the entity in its present experience release many an individual, as it did then, many a group, a nation, and give them the greater insight as to their relationships to their Creator, and that their manifestation of same is to their fellow man. For again it might be given of the entity's activities, that many of those things now being uncovered in are things that have been close to the entity's activity. Especially of interest to the entity will be a portion of the Chicago and British expeditions thereof, a portion of the sun-dial that carries the figures of the zodiac, rather in their new change to that as just begun. The entity was in the land when there were the journeyings of those peoples known as the Jewish peoples, from the Chaldean land, during that period when those first groups under Zerubbabel made for the return to the city of promise, the city where there was to be re-established a worshipfulness according to the dictates of the conscience and the trainings, and those things that have been held as tradition in those experiences of the people. The entity was among those then that were given, as would be termed today, the altar choir, and in the rebuilding the entity was among those who led first to the establishing of that routine of songs of praise for those activities when the service of the priests began, even in the courts of the temple itself. In the name then Shetung, the entity was not a mixture, but from the associations of those of Benjamin and the Judah people, but those closely associated during the activities with the Chaldeans, as to partake of the ways as well as the legends and the activities of the peoples in their return to the holy city. In the experience the entity gained. Thus may the entity in the present, from especially the Psalms of David and of Asaph, gain much, if these are read preferably in meter rather than in the ordinary way or manner. For these will bring an awakening to the entity, if conscientiously read, or sung for the beauty of what is expressed by the writers, and by the psalmist in the relationships of a creative force with man in the earth. The entity was in the promised land, during those periods when there was the returning of those peoples of promise from exile, in the rebuilding of the walls, in the redecorations of the temple, in the beginnings of again establishing the law, as was given by the leader of the entity's peoples. The entity then was with those peoples of Nehemiah, but of the household of those close to Zerubbabel, and of the tribes of the Levite peoples. Hence with the journeying of Zerubbabel, the entity was too young, and in the inclination for the associations, because of the lack, the entity later came as one well fitted for redecorations. The name then was Hanahah, the entity gained throughout, for then there was the interpreting and the application of the law, even under those hardships materially that the entity labored to interpret the law. Later the entity was an aid to Ezra, the scribe, and to those who made for the readjusting or interpreting of the law into the language of the day. For how hath it been given to those that seek to know the Lord? Thy God is one. Look not for those who may bring a message from abroad, or those who may descend from the heavens to bring word again, but rather into thine own heart. For there he hath promised to meet all. The entity was in the land, when there was the returning of the children of promise to the holy city, when there was the re-establishing of the temple service, the activities of the rebuilding of same, and rebuilding of the walls of the city. The entity was in the authority of the builders, yet given in service for the preparing and the attending of the sacrifices, that were prepared during those experiences. Hence a priest, and of the household of the Levites, and a close association with Zerubbabel, though not of the same house, in the name then Zephaniah. In the experience the entity made for closer associations with those that were in the agricultural activities, with those that were as the merchants and the tradesmen, and these made for the great stresses that were brought upon the activities of the entity in associations with those that were left in the land aforetime, when there was the carrying away to captivity. But the entity made for the better relationships, and these give the abilities for the making of closer relationships and closer undertakings between the laborers and those in authority. Hence we will find that though the activities have to do with the nature storehouses, these will also have to do with those in authority and the preservation of soil, cattle, the various characters, or kinds necessary and adaptable to the various periods or seasons or activities in various portions of the land in which the entity will make for distribution, if there is given the proper direction in this developing period of this particular experience. The entity was in the land now known as the Holy Land, during those periods when there was the returning from the land of captivity, or in the period of the rebuilding of the walls of the Holy City, and of the Temple in Jerusalem. The entity was among those peoples who chose to come with the first under Zerubbabel, yet the entity was not wholly of the Jewish, or Hebrew blood. And these very influences made for confusions when the entity made overtures, or associations with the friends and associates of Sanballat, or those who had been left in the land and known later as the Samaritans. This among the entity's own close associates caused confusion and disturbance. The entity was known as Abashah, of the peoples of the tribe of Benjamin, but of those as indicated of the Persians also. The entity was in the promised land when there was the return from the land of the Persians, and with Zerubbabel the entity came into the holy city, saw the desolation, and the raising up of purpose in the hearts and minds of individuals through the experience, and saw and hear the interpreting of much of the law as was discovered among the ruins of the temple. Hence the entity through the experience became one well-grounded, materially, in ritual and wrote for a purpose of purifying body and mind, as same was designated or dedicated for any individual activity for many. The entity gained, the entity lost through that experience, as Adonijah. For as the entity gave and let others give also, it gained. As it attempted to impel, or to prevent those not so endowed with the broader vision from their class or environ, or by the heritage of the environs in a strange land, the entity lost, as it hindered others. Yet in the present, if there will be the application in respect to the warnings that may be given to others for such activity, much may be met in the attempts to give instructions to others through the writing. The entity was in what is now known as or called the Promised Land, or Palestine, during those periods of the return of the children from the separation. There we find the entity was with the first of the groups under Zerubbabel that came into the land. There we find the entity acting as the intercessor for those peoples of that later called the Samaritan land, and the attempts to make for those periods when there would be a united effort in the rebuilding. Losing in the efforts and the activities there, the entity lost faith, lost face, with those leaders, until there were those activities under Nehemiah that brought the greater numbers and the altering as to the relationships of individuals. There we find the entity acted in the land, as one developing the mineral resources of the land. And when there were the rebuildings of the walls, the entity aided especially in the manner of the activities that made for the binding materials used in the stones. Hence we will find in the present experience that any building of wall, or any activity of the nature holds an interest for the entity, as also does the study of that which will bring union out of the devious manners of thoughts of various groups. The name then was Abijah, of the children of Judah. The entity was again in those periods of reconstruction, but under a different order, when the edicts of the king in the Persian land made it possible for the return of the children of promise to the Holy Land for the rebuilding, the re-establishing of the temple as well as the city of promise. We find the entity was among those who came with the earlier portion, or under Zerubbabel. And while there were periods of turmoil, periods of anxiety, there was builded the greater service in the temple and its activities, in the closer associations with those who would establish the home first, as might be called, or the altar in the home. And these brought into the experience of the entity then, as Shumel, the great abilities of creative forces, as to the establishing of home, the establishing of associations with others in their aids to build better environments for children, for the teaching of others for activity in individual service, as in vocational training and activities. Hence all of these influences will become in the present sojourn a part of the entity's activity and choice, that there first must come the analyzing of self, and its desires, its hopes, its aspirations. And know that these, as in that experience, are founded upon constructive forces of a spiritual import, and that the activities and associations with others may bring, as during those experiences, the greater regard for, the greater consistency in, not mere lip service, but the actual heart and mind service towards spiritual things. The entity was in that land now known as the Persian, during those periods when there were the activities of those peoples who had brought the Jewish people under bondage. The entity, though of the Persians, was rather inclined towards the persecuted peoples, because of the associations with some of those in those activities, for the entity then married a Jewess. This, to be sure, brought disturbing experiences, yet the abilities of the entity to later act in the capacity of an interpreter of and for Zerubbabel, as well as becoming closely associated with Nehemiah, brought not only the places of responsibility, but of judgments necessary in aiding those peoples when they began their return to the Holy Land. Hence we find the entity acting in those capacities, as among the helpers to those persecuted. In the present we will find the entity will become the defender always of those who are persecuted, or any that might be called the underdog. Thus we find that innate need for the manifestation more of, if you would have friends, be friendly, if you would find love, love your fellow man. Remember the greater commandment as given by him, who is Lord of lords and King of kings, love ye one another, even as I have loved you. The name then was Eliezer. The entity was in the land, when there were those returning from captivity to the Holy Land. There the entity was of those peoples who came with Zerubbabel, and among those in authority, being the companion or wife of one who served in the Holy Temple in that experience. Thus we find that the entity was among those bearing the hardships of material activities, yet enabling such to give to the generations of that experience, as well as to those to follow, the greater concept of the relationship of man to the creative forces, and how that such activities are reflected in the influence or force which directs the individual in the relationships to the fellow man, as well as to the ritualistic forces combined in the services throughout the activities, in the Holy Temple, and holy activities. Draw from those activities the fact that the body physical is indeed the temple of the living God, just as much as the temple in which there were the material sacrifices offered. So there may be mental and material sacrifices offered and experienced in the physical body in the present, if the needs would be met for the building of the determination to fill the purpose for which each soul enters a material experience. The name then was Susanna. The entity was in the land known as the Promised Land, when there were the activities in which there were those returning to the city of promise for the building up of the walls of the holy city. The entity was among those of the young who were of the household of Zerubbabel, later becoming a companion to the scribe and the priest with Nehemiah. There we find that the entity interpreted for the young, as well as the abilities for the dance, or for the exercises that brought to the peoples of the period a better physical development. Hence the entity has a liking for those things that have to do with the exercises in the open, having an interest in all forms of calisthenics, or athletics having to do with body development. All of these are a part of the entity's innate, as well as manifested experience in this present sojourn, and can be, may be, paralleled with the activities and teachings of the entity through that sojourn, through the periods of the rebuilding and the replenishing of those peoples in a holy land. The name then was Jerel. The entity was in the Promised Land, at those periods of the return of the children of promise to the rebuilding of the city, the temple, and the walls thereof. The entity then was among those close in the household of those who directed that activity, under the direct lineage of Zerubbabel, of the Levites, and thus of those of the priesthood. In the beginnings the entity aided much, but with the disputations which arose regarding others who were descendants of those left in the land, the entity sided more with those. The name then was Israel. The entity was in those activities when there was the returning of the children of promise to the Holy Land, when there were the preparations for the renewing of the service in the temple. It was when there was the re-establishing of those activities there under Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. All of these were acquaintances of the entity, but Zerubbabel was the closer relationship, for the entity was his daughter-in-law. The name then was Jephthah. In the experience the entity set the example for the mothers in that period, by the establishing, in the homes of those who returned to the city, the teaching centers for the children, for the making known of the awareness of the law as well as the ordinances, as well as the meanings of those things which had been established by Aaron and Moses and the earlier priests, as Eleazar and Edgar. All of these were the lessons the entity taught, thus El, meaning God, but in the Hebrew character as the center of the wreath in the entity's seal. The entity was in the Promised Land, during that period when there was the returning to the rebuilding of the temple, the re-establishing of the faith of the fathers in the land. The changes that were wrought brought into the experience of the entity the hardships, the longings for things, as they had been and as they might be under the varying circumstances, or as before they had been separated from the worldly aspects to consider the spiritual future of its peoples. But in service, as the entity established with the daughters of Zerubbabel, or as one of them, in the name Abijah, the entity gained materially, mentally, spiritually. So may the entity gain in this present experience, in the re-establishing of self in those ways, which are not past finding out. For, those who search to know may find him. Thus may there be brought into material activities that as will bring help, hope, joy. Do same, not as a duty, not as a buying of self-esteem, but in love, in hope, in expectancy. For the Lord loveth those who expect much of him, in giving much of themselves joyously. Let thy social life, thy family life, thy purposes and thy desires, be towards him, and joy will reign yet in thy home, thy heart, thy life, thy purpose, thy all. The entity was in the Promised Land, when there was the rebuilding of the walls of the city, with the return of those from the Persian land. There the entity came with Zerubbabel and those of the household that supplied the music in the temple activities of the nature established at that particular period. Hence again it is seen that there are the musical abilities, as well as the abilities to officiate in the offices, as related to temple or tabernacle worship. Thus we find those variations in which there will be the needs to keep the spiritual activities, as well as the physical and mental, as a part of the entity's experience, or development. There the entity was as an aid to JESHUA, as well as EZRA, in the interpreting of the law to the language of the peoples of that period. Hence we find the entity will be inclined to language, and especially the study of same, an excellent reader, an excellent interpreter of the old and the new writings. These will be the natural inclination of the entity. The name then was Eloi. The entity was in the Holy Land, or Promised Land, when there was the returning of the children of promise to the Holy Land for the establishing of the worship according to the dictates of their conscience. The entity was among the daughters of Zerubbabel, the priest, that aided in the rebuilding and the re-establishing of the temple worship in Jerusalem. Thus that latent influence for a spiritual purpose, a spiritual activity. Then, as now, know that spiritual purposes are not expressed merely by rote, but by the sowing of the seed of the Spirit of truth, which are love, brotherly kindness, patience, long-suffering. These are the trials of men and women in the material world, and yet bring to the life experience of each, that will dwell upon same, those beauties that cannot be overcome, or met by any other influence. For, fame or fortune takes wings and flies away, but hope and love and patience and faith abideth forever, and bringeth that peace as ye understand and interpreted for many in that experience, as Jesrian. The entity was a teacher, an instructor in home building, in temple service, in temple activity. And in the present the spiritual things should form, yea, must form, the basis of thy understanding, if ye would attain that as ye seek in this experience. The entity was in the Persian land, when there were those edicts by the individuals in authority, when there was the allowing of the peoples of the Holy Land to return and build the city and the temple. The entity was among those given authority to aid with those peoples active in their return. Thus the entity, it might be said, was the one given authority by the Persian king to go with Zerubbabel and those peoples, as they prepared for that unusual journey. Thus again, we see reasons for the interpreting in the entity's experience of those lands, in this particular sojourn. The entity aided much, and the interpretation of those promptings of the spiritual, as well as the mental laws through that period made for developments in those forces, that will be the greater urges in this particular experience. The name then was Zeldazar. The entity was in the Persian or Chaldean land, during those periods when there were the preparations for the return of the children of promise to the holy city, and the building up of same. There the entity was an associate with Zerubbabel the priest, being rather the musician, directing the music through those periods of the march to Jerusalem while returning to same, and also in the repairing of the temple, and in the attempts of the entity then, as Zebulun to restore some of those activities of David, who set the sounding of cymbals, of trumpets, of the harp, as a part of the worship, or at the reading of the law. The entity's interest will be found in certain characters of music, anything that is of a martial nature, or that is of a descriptive nature. As has been indicated, the song of birds, as of waters, as of many combinations of such, as thunder and lightning, and all of nature's activities, these are the characters. These may find expression, dependent upon the choice of the entity as to its field of service or activity. The entity was among those people journeying from bondage in the Chaldean land to the rebuilding of the city, the temple to the living God. There the entity was active as an aid to Zerubbabel, not as a priest but rather as a guide. For the entity had been a hunter and thus aided in carrying on those activities through even hostile lands, when the great amount of booty, or of things, had to be cared for in order to make the various offices of the priest become again effective. The entity acted in the capacity of taking care of these. Thus the entity in the present may find itself oft in that capacity, as one building or keeping funds for various propositions, or various conditions where these are to be used for the edification, the clarification, or as a helpful experience for those less fortunate than those contributing even themselves to such undertakings. The name then was EZRA. The entity was in the Holy Land, during those periods, when there were those returnings from captivity, when there were the activities of Ezra, Nehemiah and Zerubbabel. The entity was among the daughters of Zerubbabel, who entered into the temple service, and yet, with the periods when there were the upheavals brought about the changes when Nehemiah made those revolutionary edicts, the entity swore vengeance. And he who swears vengeance pays even unto the last farthing. So it brought developments, retardments, for when there is jealousy, hate, things that do not make the soul of man free, these bring retardments to an individual in his activities in the earth. The entity was in the name then Ardar. The entity was in the Holy Land, when there were those returnings to the worship of the only God. With the rebuilding of the temple and those activities under Zerubbabel, the entity first came to the land. The divisions or disputations, which arose among the second and third groups, who returned, brought disturbance and disorder into the experience of the entity, yet the ability to plan, the ability to become very staid or set or hard-headed, all arise from the experiences of the entity then as Perthuel. The entity was in the lands now known as or called the Promised Land, during those periods when there was the return from the exile. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel did the entity return to the holy city. And as there were those attempts to rebuild the temple and the walls, we find the king called on the entity to act in the capacity as a mediator between the peoples of that individual land and those who had returned for the re-establishing of the land. Hence we find the entity made overtures to those of the land. In the present we find abilities from that sojourn, for with Nehemiah, Ezra and the rest of those in authority, the entity, as ZERUBBABEL, made for much help and strengthening during those turmoils that were brought by those because of the refusal of the priests to join with the Samaritans in that labor. The entity was in what is now called the Promised Land, during those periods of the return of the wanderers and those who sought to set up or readjust themselves in a land where there was the rebuilding, the replenishing, the readjustments to the variations which had come about by that long sojourn in a strange land, when the laws and tenets and principles had become merely those of hearsay, merely those things that were, yet no one having wholly or fully experienced them. There we find the entity was with Zerubbabel, and those peoples returning to the holy city. The entity made for friendships with many of the natives, and with the conditions surrounding, in the name then Abjadal, being in associations with those in authority, being in connection with those put in places of confidence and hope. Yet the entity held not altogether to those tenets, and there came a period through which much disturbance arose owing to the conditions and hardships that were brought about.